Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube or on Rumble. In the past two streams, I hosted multiple experts to discuss the US elections, the outcome of the US elections, what it means for the United States and for the rest of the world. We had guests who were very critical of the US establishment, and they were very critical of both parties, the Republican Party and the Democrats, and they have no hope, let's say, in any sort of tangible reform, genuine reform that could come from these elections. We had Matthew Ho with us. We had yesterday two other guests to discuss this developing issue, Patrick Henningsen, Dan Kovalek, Thomas Mallington. So we had four guests. All of them had different opinions on what has happened in the United States with these elections and the outcome of this election. Today's, however, stream is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to focus today on a particular issue, and that is why the liberal world order, which was established after the end of the Second World War, and the imposition of these liberal systems and set of values, rules-based international order on the rest of the world. So there are certain bureaucrats, certain institutions, certain organizations, politicians, political parties, they are in a panic mode because Donald Trump won this election. So we're going to focus on this particular element to see why they are in a panic mode and why Donald Trump's victory in this election is a nightmare for them, not because of the Donald Trump, not because Donald Trump is going to be a savior, as some of the Republicans and pro-Trumpers and MAGA supporters and Maha supporters are claiming, but rather because he represents a different set of values and he wants to replace the current international system, the value-based international system, into a different nature of international system, but at the same time, he wants to preserve and keep the US hegemonic status. So no one has to have any illusions that Donald Trump is going to all of a sudden isolate himself and his country from the rest of the world. He wants to lead the world. He wants to continue the US as an hegemonic power, but with different tools and different means, and he has a different approach. And that is why the people, especially in Brussels, the EU, the NGOs, the neoliberal activists, the climate change activists, feminist activists, I'm talking mostly about the radicals among these activists and bureaucrats, they are in a panic mode. Now, if you follow the mainstream press and if you especially listen to the talking heads on MSNBC, on CNN, and the rest of the pro-democratic TV outlets, I have watched multiple videos today on X, and I was not really surprised because they are still living in self-denial. And they don't want to really recognize the mistakes the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, and then the so-called transition from Biden to Kamala Harris have done to their reputation and to their project in the United States. They are living in self-denial that the projects they have imposed on the people, their liberal agenda, is choking the people, and they have tested the people and pushed them to the edge basically. So they have tried to impose the gender ideology. They have tried to impose all these different, let's say, sexual identities. The problem was that people were mostly tolerant, but until they came especially to some of the issues related to transgenderism and imposing it on the people and especially on children in the curriculum in different countries and in different states in the United States and in Europe, then some of the families, they have risen up and they started to talk and push against this agenda. Now, one of the issues, for example, related to this neoliberal set of values is that if you don't, like, they are basically undemocratic democratic liberals. So they call themselves liberals. There is a big contradiction between liberalism and dictatorship, right, or tyranny. They can't really come together. But these so-called liberals, they have made a miracle, and they have become tyrants because in their approach, if you have a different opinion for their agenda and for their ideology and for whatever policies they are pursuing, especially when it comes to our body autonomy, when it comes to our kids, when it comes to our family, when it comes to our relationships, and they want to have a control over these, let's say, relationships, then if you don't accept them, you are a bad person. You are a fascist, you are a neo-Nazi, you are a Trump supporter, and probably your grandfather was in the SS Army. This is how they treat the people, right? Anything that anyone who disagrees with their approach is basically a far right, a fascist, and neo-Nazi. They don't want to say that they have failed on multiple layers. They don't want to say that they wrecked basically the US economy. They don't want to say that they started and provoked a war in Ukraine, which has killed around probably 1 million people between both sides, Ukrainians and Russians. They don't want to say that they blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, which wrecked the German economy and by extension the European economy. They don't want to say that they have supported, financed, enabled, protected Israel in its extermination war against the Palestinians in Gaza. They don't want to say that this has led to an entire region in the Middle East has become on fire, for example. They don't want to say that they lied to the Americans. They don't want to say that they are lying to the Americans about the border crisis. They're lying to the people about the food supply chains. They lie to the people about the injections, right? All these failures led to the election of Trump. And I'm only talking about why the people voted Trump, why the people went and they stood in line and they voted for Trump. I'm not talking about the behind the scenes work and how they polished the reputation of Trump or they paved the way for Trump to come to power. I'm not talking about the shadow forces. I'm just talking about the people who voted for Trump, right? So the Democratic Party, basically, they presented Kamala Harris, zero character. I truly doubt that she has the IQ level is below average. She's not a politician. And they just presented her as a woman and a person of color and reproductive rights and everything that was persistent under the Biden administration. So it was a copy-paste of the Biden administration. Nothing would have been changed despite the inflation. The people have certain needs. The people have real demands. The people want to afford medication. The people want to afford food. The people want to afford college. The people have real demands. The so-called liberal values, you cannot really take a value and eat it and feed your son or children. You cannot really take these ideologies and fill your pocket with it. You cannot really, all these values and teachings and preachings that the so-called neoliberals have been choking us for a long time, they don't really benefit us, basically. And what are the solutions for the major crisis that they say humanity faces? For example, the climate change. What is the solution for climate change? Taxing people? I mean, if you live in Germany, guys, I assure you that the taxes that we pay here, it's so crazy that you cannot really believe that if you live in Germany and if you are not part of a very few career niches, then you would never make money in Germany. It's impossible. Like, it's impossible for someone to save money, right? If you make 1,500 euros per month or you make 2,500 euros per month, you will not save any money. And it's not because your expenses grow, it's because the taxes grow, right? And everything is becoming more expensive day by day, including groceries, including our energy bills, including electricity, everything. Like these lights that I'm lighting this stream now, it costs me lots of money now because I live in Germany. And this has all happened because of the Biden administration's policies in Europe and blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines and the German government's basically inaction and decoupling of the German economy from the Russian energy resources, right? Because the German Greens and the SPDs, so-called social democrats, they have their own green fantasies, and they have turned off the nuclear reactors. They don't want to buy gas from Russia. So what has become? What did they really expect for the prices to happen, and what did they expect for the factories and manufacturers to happen? And you see now that the German government has collapsed and they're going to have a snap elections early next year. So we will see about that. It's a situation that people have to understand that there has been a major failure, and especially failure to represent the best interests of the people. And the people now looking for a messiah. And I'm not saying Trump is a messiah. He's not a savior, by the way, but the people like to see someone as their savior. That's why Trump has been presented to the people as the savior. And he has been promoted by multiple forces in the United States, including bureaucrats, including oligarchs, including billionaires, and on X he had also preferable coverage. I'm not talking about the mainstream media. Mainstream media's coverage was horrible. However, now that Trump is going to become the president and he will be in charge of the White House, there is a growing panic mode in Europe as well. And this is quite obvious if you watch the German press. And today, our friend Thomas Fazi published an article in The Unheard. The title of the article is How Trump Could Liberate Europe. His Isolationism is an Opportunity. So do you really think that Trump can liberate Europe? Now, if you are a sane politician and you follow the interests of your own people, Trump's second term could be an opportunity for your country, if you are a European country, especially if you are a strong European country, to decouple your fate and destiny from the destiny of the United States and stop following the dictates of the United States, especially if these dictates harm your economy and your own people, right? So this represents an opportunity for the European continent, but will the European countries take this opportunity? That's the real question. So the bureaucrats in the EU, they see this Trump second term as a complete nightmare. And because in the past years, especially in the last 4 years, they have been undermining. Yeah, if you put it in this context, these politicians and these bureaucrats in the EU, especially in the past 4 years, they have been undermining the EU's strategic interests by submissively aligning themselves with the Biden administration's reckless foreign policy everywhere, from China to Gaza. This is what our friend Thomas says, and I totally agree with him. And what was the result of it? The result was that we have Europe today is politically, economically, and militarily vassalized to the United States than any point since 1945. I mean, after 1945, Europe has become more or less closer and closer to the United States, but at no point it has become vassalized as today since post-War II, World War II. And more to this point, the European elites, they have allowed themselves to be dragged by Washington into a disastrous proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And they have basically condemned their citizens to collapsing industry and rising prices. And despite all the sacrifices that these European elites and European politicians have made for the sake of the United States, Trump's isolationist bent means it could ultimately all be for nothing. So if they had hopes that these sacrifices would result in positive, let's say, outcome for Europe, this is not going to be the case now under Trump. if he pursues an isolationist foreign policy. Now, in the past few years, the European leaders, especially the EU leaders, let's say, they have framed their entire foreign policy in American terms. So first we had the NATO expansionism. Economically, the EU decoupled itself from Russia, and they supported Ukraine's victory at all costs strategy, even at the expense of Europe's actual interests, right? And this was all supposedly part of an existential struggle between the democracy versus tyranny. And this is the talking point all the time that the European leaders try to, when they try to convince the people that this is an existential war. If we don't defeat Russia, then tyranny will have its upper hand over the entire European continent. If bad Putin wins this war, then tyrants like Putin, like Xi Jinping, and this is what they say, right? They will have an upper hand over the international system. So we have to protect democracy and democratic values and liberal values. Therefore, we have to win at any cost and as long as it takes. This is the narrative. This is the talking point, right? So, but we have now Trump. Thomas says that he came back in charge, and his administration probably or likely going to pursue an isolationist bent. And this means that all the sacrifices that the European bureaucrats have made could, at the end of the day, become pointless, right? So we have, for many years, the European bureaucrats, they have established or they have promoted and backed what is called the mutually reinforcing roles of NATO and the European Union. And they saw these mutually reinforcing roles between NATO and the European Union as a bulwark against Russia to ensure Western dominance globally. So they saw that EU has its own roles and NATO has its own roles, and there are some, mutual ground between the EU and NATO, and these two blocks would represent a bulwark against Russia in order to keep the Western hegemony intact. Now, a weakened United States commitment to NATO means that it will threaten basically the very foundations of the EU's newfound ideological identity and extension of the American umbrella. So if the EU bureaucrats saw that the EU represents an extension of NATO as a pushback against Russia in order to keep Western dominance, then if Trump reduces his support for NATO, then the EU will find itself in a very fragile and weak situation, right? So Thomas continues and says the potential withdrawal of American arms and cash from Kiev also means that he will seriously hamper the EU's ability to continue the proxy war in Ukraine, especially given the tight finances and sluggish military-industrial complex of many member states. Now, the incoming Republican administration, despite all the talk about trying to freeze the funds for Ukraine and end the war or freeze the contact lines and try to open channels with Russia, despite all this talk, Thomas says that this Republican administration will continue to deliver weapons to Kiev, but ask Europe to foot the bill. And this situation would allow the conflict to smolder on even as Europe gets poorer. So if Donald Trump follows his promises and he basically imposes his will on the European bureaucrats and forces them to increase the expenditure in NATO or increase the finances in Ukraine, because the US will withdraw in its finances and its expenditure over Ukraine. This automatically and naturally means Europe will become poorer, because the amount of money that the United States has spent in Ukraine, they are with tens of billions of dollars. And this means if the Europeans want to continue this war, this proxy war against Russia, by using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, they have to finance this war. And how are they going to finance this war, right? First of all, they don't have the proper military-industrial complex to sustain against the Russians. And secondly, it is going to be very, very costly for them. And this is going to come from the pockets of the people. The people are the ones, through inflation and through taxing, they're going to finance this war. So the European people will eventually become poorer if the European continent or if the EU decides to continue this conflict as long as it takes. And in this situation, if Trump withdraws his finances from Ukraine. So, however, this outcome, Thomas says, could be avoided, but it takes the European leaders, if the European leaders understood that putting an end to the war in Ukraine and normalizing relations with Russia are in the continent's ultimate economic and security interests. If they were clever, they might even seize upon Trump's instinctive isolationism and push for a settlement themselves. So basically, they have to come back to their senses, to the policy approach before February 2022, which in my opinion, even if the European leaders decide to do so, they're not going to find an open arms in Moscow and Russia itself and just forget whatever happened and we continue business as usual. It's not going to be the case. And the Russians know very well, in my opinion, that it's the United States driving this war, so they would prefer to deal with the United States as a dominant power over Europe instead of dealing with or trying to find a certain solution with Europe separately. So this would be my opinion about this. However, Thomas says this is an unlikely outcome, that the Europeans would deal with Russia and try to solve this situation separately with Russia without the United States, because the European elites are they have to totally reverse their policy in Ukraine. And this means that they have to admit their own failure in Ukraine, right? And they would not do that. They would not swallow this defeat. So this vast economic pain, the EU's pro-Kiev stance, has caused regular Europeans. The resulting political backlash would obviously be devastating for ruling parties. And this obvious financing and continuing the war in Ukraine is a heavy burden on the European citizens, and this will eventually lead into different electoral outcomes, one of which is now we saw the collapse of the German government, and soon I think in 2 months, if there is a new election, then we will see most probably non-mainstream parties coming to the coalition, because the people are fed up with the establishment or the mainstream parties. Now, there is something very important that Thomas Fazi says here in this article. He says, however, making peace with Russia would force European leaders to finally acknowledge the multipolar order that now exists right across the globe, a reality whereby a free and independent Europe could act as a bridge between the West and the emerging Eurasian powers of the young century. For another, it would force them to realize that their future lies in breaking free from Washington's grip, rejecting the latter's desperate attempts to preserve its authority. However, most EU leaders are just too wedded to transatlanticism, ideologically, psychologically, and materially, to fully escape, regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. That's why he says, I don't share the optimism of those who claim that Trump's focus on America first policies will push the EU to pursue greater strategic autonomy. So the EU has a golden opportunity now to pursue an independent approach in the European continent, in Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine, and restore ties with Russia, which they are not going to do, because this means that they have to admit that their strategy has failed, and they're too arrogant, in my opinion, to accept that and swallow it. And also intellectually, I'm really suspicious of their capability to understand beyond their ideologies, because they are so driven with ideologies that they truly believe that this is a war between a tyranny and a democracy. And for them, this is an existential conflict. If they lose this conflict, this will lead into a multipolar world in which tyrants like Putin and Xi Jinping are going to have leading roles in the international system. This is how they see it. This is the lens they watch the world. Therefore, they would vehemently reject a deal that could give Russia this status or China this status. But as we said multiple times, and this is not something like I'm not here to make wishful thinking. I'm not a mainstream journalist, but the bus has left the station already. And the Chinese rise is unstoppable. They cannot really stop China. And they cannot really stop the growing relationship between China and Russia. And as much as they push against and try to impose certain security threats against Russia, Russia will become closer to China. And similarly, as long as they try to encourage the Taiwanese to separate from China, as much as China will become closer and closer with Russia. So they have created the conditions for these two countries to become closer and closer together. This is what I would argue. Now, since we're almost at the half of this live streaming, guys, I would really appreciate it. Look, my channel is shadow banned 100%. There is no doubt about it. I have 85,000 subscribers and a few people only can see the videos. Secondly, because of the shadow banning, if I'm speaking about certain topics, for example, the US elections, they would see me as, trying to influence public opinion in the United States. So they boldly and very strongly suppress the content that I am speaking about US elections. And I'm not intervening in their affairs. I'm just analyzing the situation. So I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button as you watch this live streaming. That would be a great help on YouTube and on Rumble. So we have now a situation that Kamala Harris lost the elections, and 24 hours later, the German government declared that the coalition has collapsed, and they're going to organize elections soon in probably February or March 2025. So some people, of course, say this means that the Biden and Harris administration were in charge of Germany. I don't endorse this, but the timing is really a little bit baffling, right? And in one of the statements, Scholz, the current chancellor, he admitted on Wednesday that the election of Donald Trump spurred the government's collapse. So he said that Trump's return to the White House added to the urgency of having a clear economic stance for the country so that Berlin can show we can be relied on in the future. The German mainstream media is, of course, they are, I would say, very paranoid about multiple things, especially when it comes to the election of Donald Trump, because they know that once Donald Trump comes to power, especially in this second term, this is also going to boost the status of the populist parties in Germany, one of which is the Alternative for Germany. Alternative for Germany is a right-wing populist party, and we have the Sarah Wagenknecht. I'm butchering her name. I tried to pronounce it correctly multiple times. It just doesn't work. Anyways, so Zara's party is a left-wing populist, and we have the AfD right-wing populist, right? And they have hosted the leader of the right-wing populist party, Alice Weidel, on I think this was on Welt TV. Yeah, this is on Welt TV. So they hosted her and they started this conversation with hate, trying to they portrayed the AfD, the right-wing populist party, as a party of hatred and basically, yeah. And they have received a big backlash. And she says, so the German AfD politician, she is the leader of the party, Weidel, is asked, she also wants to use hate and agitation like Donald Trump in her political campaigns. She has none of it and pushes back. She says people are sick of the media and don't want to hear that garbage anymore. Plus, the young people are sick of this woke gender crap. So this video includes English subtitles in yellow. You can see it while we are watching. Take a look.
Mit Hass und Hetze wie wir es vorher noch nie gekannt haben. Ist er auch in dieser Hinsicht ein Vorbild für Sie? Wollen Sie künftig den Ton noch verschärfen?
Also Sie framen jetzt mich mit Hass und Hetze, also genau diese ganze Rhetorik, die Sie gegen Donald Trump aufgefahren haben. Und da lassen Sie mich eins sagen. Donald Trump hat genau deshalb, wegen der Hass und Hetze, wegen der Verächtlichmachung aus dem Ausland, von den Mainstream-Medien, hat er diese Wahlen ja auch gewonnen, weil die Leute sich nicht mehr für dumm verkaufen lassen. Dieser ganze woke linke Schwachsinn, der hier auch mit von den Mainstream-Medien gestützt wird, das lassen die Leute nicht mehr mit sich machen. Und vor allen Dingen haben die jungen Leute Donald Trump gewählt. Warum? Weil sie vernünftig ausgebildet werden wollen und nicht mehr diesen ganzen woken linken Gender-Quatsch gelehrt bekommen wollen, sondern echte Zukunftsperspektiven mit einem vernünftigen Bildungssystem. Und genau daran krankt es in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland aus. Ich werde Ihnen sagen, was passiert, wenn die AfD in der Regierung sitzt. Sie wird genau diesen ganzen Gender-Quatsch aus dem Bildungsplan rauswerfen und den jungen Menschen in diesem Land, der arbeitenden Bevölkerung, Perspektiven geben.
So you see the type of question. The question is, Donald Trump won the election on hatred and hate speech. Are you also planning on winning or utilizing the same strategy in the upcoming elections, right? Donald Trump didn't only win on hatred, right? I mean, and both sides, they have certain hate speech. And I'm not like coming and saying that who defines hate speech at the end, right? And if I'm going to take the mainstream media seriously, what I'm doing here now on this podcast, it's hate speech, right? This is everything that is a little bit on the right side of their woke neoliberal set of values. It's right-wing fascism. It's crazy. So what the media Germany is doing, they're just recycling the same media strategy in the US against their opponent here, the AfD, right-wing populist party, instead of learning something from the mistakes of MSNBC and CNN and try to use a different approach against their enemies, right-wing populist party, to try to block them from coming to power, right? So they don't learn from their mistakes, and they're repeating the same thing over and over again, into extent that the conspiracy theorists say that this type of coverage and this type of rhetoric and this type of narrative against populist parties, whether right or left, is actually helping them. Because nowadays, the right-wing populist party in Germany or the left-wing populist party in Germany, when they receive so much backlash and criticism from the mainstream press, they're weaponizing it and using it as a badge of honor in front of their people and say, this corrupted mainstream press, which lied to you about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10,000 times, this is the same media that is attacking us, which means we're doing something correct, even if they're not doing something correct, right? This is how they use these media attacks and smear campaigns against them. It has become counterproductive, in my opinion. And they don't only criticize the right-wing populist party, they also criticize the left-wing populist party, which Zara's political party, Zara Wagenknecht's political party. And Max Blumenthal, he shared this screenshot with us. He says, nice to see the pro-war transatlanticists losing it over left populist Zara Wagenknecht's demand to draw down the Ukraine proxy war and get US warheads off German territory. So what's happening is we have in Germany local elections, and in these local elections, the mainstream parties, they wanted to keep the AfD, the right-wing populist party, out of any government, local government. So they prefer to deal with Zara's party to keep the AfD out of power in these regional governments, right? But Zara told them that there is a price for it. And if I want to be part of the coalition in any of these local governments, I insist that all 3 regional governments that she joins come out against German weapons supplies to Ukraine and the stationing of American medium-range missiles on German soil. And here says that represents a direct challenge to Scholz and the Zeitenwende policies he has pursued since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They are also anathema to CDU leader Friedrich Merz, who is even more gung-ho than Scholz on arming Ukraine. So in whatever side you look, you have the right-wing populist party. They are again sending weapons to Ukraine and end the war and restore relations with Russia. And the left-wing populist is similar. What these two parties differ in foreign policy is Israel. The AfD is completely unhinged when it comes to Israel. I'm going to be very honest with you. They want to support Israel to the end, and they weaponize anti-Semitism, and they say, this increase of anti-Semitism in Germany is because of the migrants. And today I saw some speech from an AfD politician thanking the Greens for adopting their own language, which says that the migrants have brought anti-Semitism in Germany because of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations, right? But the left-wing populist party, Zara's party, they want to boycott, or they want to stop sending weapons also to Israel. So the only political party in Germany which has around 10% of the votes at the current moment, which is, let's say, has a comprehensive anti-war position, is the left-wing populist party, which is not enough. 10% is very, very little in this case, in my opinion. And if you want to see one of the articles that was published in the German mainstream press and you want to laugh about it, this is in the Zeit. So the Zeit Online, they published this article on Trump's victory, and this is what the article is titled. This is the title of the article. I just translated it. It's a auto translation from German to English. And I don't want to go through all the article. I just want to show you. They say, will you ever understand why someone chooses Donald Trump? So why any American would vote for Donald Trump? And they say, to understand why a person makes a decision, to understand the circumstances under which you make the decision yourself would have made. And you can really imagine a lot. Anger. So anger could be a reason to vote for Donald Trump. They say anger can imagine protest election anyway. Hatred of elites, which is correct. Economic hardship, which is correct. Even racism, they say, and sexism is clear. So sexism and racism is part, of course, of voting for Donald Trump. If you have, it would be a man. If you were Christian, if you lived, sorry, this is just a false translation. I mean, if you're a man, if you're a Christian in the United States, you have multiple reasons to vote for Donald Trump. Now, because the Western European mainstream media is so, how to say, they have Trump derangement syndrome. This is what they're calling it, I think, on this alternative podcast. Trump derangement syndrome. So they have brainwashed their people for a very long time that Trump is the Hitler, right? This is what they say about Trump. So if you see this chart, which is European voting intention on 2024 US presidential election. If you see this chart, guys, you will realize that the European countries, right? How many percentage of these countries would have voted for Harris? 96% would have voted for Harris in Denmark, 90% in Finland, 90% in Sweden, 87% in Netherlands, 86% in Norway, 85% in Germany, 84% in Ireland, 83% in France, Lithuania 83%, Austria 82%, Spain 80%, Portugal 79%, Belgium 78%, Italy 75%, Estonia 74%, Switzerland 72%, Latvia, Poland, United Kingdom, Kosovo, Romania, Greece, and Croatia are in the range of 60%, between 60 to 70%. Then we have Czech Republic, 54%. And then below in Slovenia, Slovakia, Moldova, Bulgaria, Hungary, Georgia, Serbia, and Russia are between 40% and 22%. So this is how the indoctrination of the European people has undergone in the past at least decade against Donald Trump. And I'm not defending Donald Trump. I'm just trying to explain why the Europeans would prefer Harris over Trump, right? And there are so many also activists, for example, Owen Jones, which I realized that he's one of these podcasters who keep talking positive things about Palestine and then trying to destroy Syria and Iran because of his fantasy worldview about democracy and liberal values. He says, I'm going back to my hotel in New York with a Muslim Pakistani American cab driver who voted for Donald Trump because the prices were too high under Biden. They don't really understand it because they live in a la-la land and they're completely detached from the working class. And Chris says, dear brown servant, why aren't you as hysterical as I want you to be? He's very correct on this. And these people thrive on hysteria. They thrive on fear. If you don't inject enough fear in the society, their entire value system and their entire worldview could collapse. So they need to resort to this type of warmongering tactics. Now, of course, very few people want you to understand why the people voted for Trump. This is the serious and most important thing, I think, for many people to understand. So why Trump won? David Sachs, of course, he's pro-Trump, but he's explaining it correctly, in my opinion. They say, while the legacy media has a meltdown searching for hitherto undiagnosed psychosis in the electoral to explain its embrace of a Hitlerian strongman, the truth is much simpler than their fictions. This election is a reminder that after all the manufactured drama and overheated rhetoric, politics is still about issues. Whether you agreed with him or not, Trump ran a substantive campaign based on issues like the border, inflation, crime, and war. Harris ran on vibes, celebrity endorsements, name-calling, convicted felon, fascist, debunked hoaxes, verifying people, and platitudes like democracy. She would neither defend the Biden-Harris record nor say what she would do differently. When she did talk about specific issues, they were often stolen from Trump. Child tax credit, no tax on trips, and border funding. On the issue where Democrats have an advantage, like abortion, Trump deftly got ahead of the issue by rejecting a national ban and removing problematic language from the GOP platform. Harris wore out the issue by blatantly lying about Trump's position and by exhibiting her own party's extremist, nobody needed to see an abortion track at the DNC. While Trump expanded his coalition with MAHA, health issues, and dodgy government efficiency, Harris concluded her ersatz campaign by going all in on demonizing her opponent, pretending Madison Square Garden was a Nazi convention. The fact that voters saw through it should be reassuring, even if you don't agree with the result. Voters want to know how a candidate will give them a better life, and increasingly, they have learned to tune out the rest as noise. While the legacy media creates excuses and impugns the motives of voters to explain why Trump won, the reason is simple. Trump is the candidate who spoke to voters' concerns directly. It's the issues, stupid. I think he really summed up well why the ordinary people, just normal people, why they voted for it. He's a very good communicator with the people. He's a populist. He's using the language that the people want to hear. They're sick and tired of people with their suits and ties, with we say in German Hochsprache, it's a cooked language, it's a language that you talk in communication in diplomatic cables, like somebody who is like an actor, these politicians have become like these serious faces and acting skills and just easy ways to maneuver around questions, not to give any answers to questions, and not to really address the real issues. That's the major issue. Like, American people would like to know answers about how Kamala Harris would reduce the inflation? What would be the answer for the Ukraine war? And what would be the answer for sending weapons to Israel, for example? And the role of the US under Biden and Harris in Gaza, right? They will go to the dustbin of history as the administration which funded and enabled a war of extermination against the Palestinians. And we will never forgive and never forget. We will remember it forever. So their names, there is a stain on their names now because of this. And history will not be friendly to them. Believe me, this time, they're not going to be the victorious from this. It's going to take longer time, and then history will be written, and their names will be mentioned as enablers of a war of extermination against the Palestinians. Glenn Deason, who is a very good doctor and a professor, and I think that he is one of the people that is underrated in the mainstream academia because of his unique views about Ukraine and his critical approach to Europe becoming a vassal continent to United States. So they sideline him from so many forums. Because if you have an independent thought that's not welcomed under this liberal world order, right? And even in academia, you have to be sure that universities and faculties and the boards and everything is under a strong grip. So even in academia, even if you are postdoctorate and you have brilliant ideas, if it doesn't suit their agenda, you will be rejected, right? And I think that this is something that he expressed brilliantly in his new article, the Trump's victory and the decline of the post-neoliberal order. And I just summarize it very quickly to you, and we're going to only address a few points of his Substack article. He says, the opponents of Trump demonstrate a remarkable difficulty in articulating the case for Trump. Even if they know why people voted for him, they would feel morally compelled to refrain from articulating the reasons in fear of legitimizing his policies with understanding. The inability to articulate the position of an adversary is a good indication of being propagandized. The panic and confusion is also caused by a dishonest media. The media has almost exclusively negative coverage of Trump, while Harris can do no wrong. Trump did not win despite the bad media coverage, but because of it. This is the same point that I made when this German mainstream TV channel interviewed Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD. They are winning despite the bad media coverage. They are winning because of the bad media coverage, because the people have no trust in the media any longer. A populist claims to be the real representative of the people who will defend them against a detached and corrupt elite. The animosity toward Trump and his supporters was therefore worn as a badge of honor. See? Europe is in panic as they lost their ally in the White House and thus fear for the future of the liberal international order. Yet the liberal international order is already gone, and an ideological Europe is suffering from Stockholm syndrome. Biden is complicit in genocide in Palestine. He attacked Europe's critical energy infrastructure, lured Europe's industries to relocate to the US under the Inflation Reduction Act, brought major war to Europe by provoking a proxy war in Ukraine and sabotaging the peace negotiations in Istanbul. He intensified censorship around the world and pressures the Europeans to reduce economic connectivity with China. After years of aspiring for strategic autonomy and devassalization, the Europeans have subordinated themselves and accepted diminishing relevance in the world. The Europeans are also worried that a similar leadership crisis has come to their own continent. Political elites committed to liberal hegemony have neglected national interest and will be swept away in the years to come. I think I wouldn't have explained this in any better way, to be honest with you, about this shift on the danger and the threat against the neoliberal world order. and the panic in Europe and the need for an independent European policy in Europe itself, in Ukraine, in Russia, and also in the Middle East. I think that would be a win-win situation for everyone, because nowadays the people cannot really find the difference between the European foreign policy and an American foreign policy, and at some junctures and points and files, some of the European countries' foreign policies are worse, basically, when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to Lebanon, when it comes to Syria. It's crazy how some of the European politicians have, like, there is a competition to become who is more hawkish and who is more neocon. It has become like it's their credit score, you know. They have to prove to someone who is more hawkish and who is more worse on foreign policy. Now, Trump is not going to be better on Middle East. I can categorically assure you that. And there's already a talk that he may appoint Brian Hook as one of his foreign policy picks and one of the candidates for his foreign policy or the Secretary of State. I hope he doesn't become that. He doesn't take that position. And Brian Hook, he served under George W. Bush, and he's reportedly going to be in the new Trump term. I hope not. And if he comes to as a foreign secretary or part of a national security advisor or something, that's going to be horrible. And he's a Iran hawk. He helped lead the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, sabotage, and assassinations under previous Trump administration against Iran. And yeah, so this is a horrible decision. And also Mike Pompeo, we'll see what's going to be with Mike Pompeo. Imagine Thomas Friedman, who is an establishment stooge and a mainstream intellectual whose job is to whitewash the US empire dominance around the world for a very long time. Even he is worried of Donald Trump's green card to possible carte blanche to Netanyahu. I mean, I'm not saying that Biden didn't give this carte blanche. There was some disagreements at some points, but at the end, Netanyahu did whatever he wanted. And the Biden and Harris administration didn't stop him from doing any of these crimes, right? They didn't do the minimum. Harris and Biden, they're not only complicit, they're partners. So I'm not trying to say otherwise. But even in the US, there are people like Thomas Friedman. They say that my biggest fear for Israel is that Trump will feel like it's too messy and let Bibi do whatever he wants and say annex it. And 7 million Jews will occupy more than 7 million Arabs, which will be the long-term destruction of Israel. We'll see about that. In the past administration, Trump was one of the biggest Zionist presidents, right? And his rhetoric basically was like he has the willingness to support Israel's military efforts, including his statement that Israel should be allowed to finish the job in Gaza. So Trump's administration, they didn't put any pressure on Israel regarding issues like the blockade on Gaza, settlement expansion, human rights abuses, and don't forget that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem and recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. And I thought there is an earthquake happening, but it's my washing machine. So anyways, I don't have any hope from Donald Trump to have a better foreign policy approach. But the situation in West Asia or the Middle East also has changed drastically. And Trump's current presidency is not going to have, he's going to face different conditions than he had in between 2016 and 2020. And this was explained by Professor Marandi, He was on RT. So just for you to know, guys, this interview is part of the RT. So I had to zoom in a little bit to remove the RT logo from the video, from the screen, because then YouTube will block the video and demonetize it. So I just zoomed in to take out the logo, but see what he has to say.
We heard that the comment before we started talking, and it was a stark admission. Tehran saying that it's resisted US pressure over the past 40 years of sanctions. Well, something's not working then if 4 decades of sanctions have been implemented, and we're at the situation we are today with so much friction, and Iran, having friendships and business deals with other nations, global south primarily. So there's an issue at play here going forward, that if it doesn't work, why are you doing the same thing all over again?
Yes, and the last 4 years has really destroyed the United States in other ways as well. The sanctions have not worked. They've expanded the sanctions, and as I said, they helped create an incentive for BRICS to find a solution. But also the United States has has destroyed its image across the world by supporting this genocide, and so have the Europeans. So the United States, its economy is on the decline. Its image has been destroyed. Its tools for imposing its will on other countries have diminished, as you've rightly pointed out. And so really, a sane leader in Washington would look for an alternative solution. That was not pursued by Biden. That was not pursued by Trump during his first 4 years. Even with regards to Russia, Trump spoke positively about relations with Russia, but he continued to pursue the same policies as previous presidents, especially the one before him, in pushing the Ukraine towards greater conflict with Russia. So we haven't seen any evidence that the United States is going to change direction. But I think reality is going to increasingly put pressure on the United States to shift. And if it doesn't do so, then I think the United States will pay a very heavy price. In any case, this is not the world that Trump was dealing with when he was president. Things have changed a lot. The West has declined, and the global majority is further empowered.
Yeah, a lot of issues at play. Thanks very much for...
So this was the segment I wanted to show you of Marandi. He says Trump will be facing a very different political reality from what he experienced during his first term. The global political, economic, and military balance of power has shifted. Meanwhile, the global South looks at the collective West with disgust because of the Gaza issue. Now, as I was checking my mobile, there was a new speech by Sevim Dagdelen. Sevim is on the left populist party in Germany. And as I mentioned in the past streams, that there is going to be a new law in Germany about anti-Semitism, and criticizing Israel will be anti-Semitism soon in Germany. And they are the only party who voted against this motion. All other parties voted in favor. They're the only ones. She says the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht is the only group in the German Bundestag to oppose the government's regressive motion suppressing freedom of speech under the guise of combating anti-Semitism. You have us on your side. We, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, are firmly opposed to your attack on academic, artistic, and cultural freedom, on fundamental rights and international law. I don't want to say further about this anti-Semitism law. I don't want to end up in a dungeon soon. Anyways, thank you so much, guys, for tuning into today's live streaming. I really appreciate you all, whether you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble. Before leaving this stream, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button so that this content reaches to many other people. And if you'd like to support this independent work, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling here on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you tomorrow on Friday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you and upon your families. Salam.